January 8, 1940, London. A thin winter light lies across the pavement like dusted ash. The city is awake before sunrise, boots on wet stone, the clipped rhythm of footsteps under blackout rules, the faint metallic rasp of shutters being lifted. Outside a small grocer's shop, a queue forms with the slow patience of people who have learned that waiting is now part of citizenship. In gloved hands, ration books are opened like prayer books, paper creased at the spine, coupons still crisp with the promise of order. Somewhere down the street, a tram bell rings once, then fades. Overhead, the sky holds its breath, as if it too is learning the arithmetic of scarcity. This moment matters because rationing was never only about food. It was about the moral geometry of total war, how a nation turns private appetite into public discipline, how governments attempt to translate need into policy, and how ordinary people become the final living mechanism of strategy. In the Second World War, bombs and bullets were only the most visible weapons. The quieter war was fought in kitchens, coal bins, shoe repair shops, and on the long lines outside stores, where the home front learned that the outcome of global battles could depend on something as small as a stamp torn from a booklet. In the United States, the Office of Price Administration administered rationing through a vast local network, thousands of boards staffed by citizen volunteers, turning democracy into an administrative machine powered by neighbors and paper. At the start, many Axis soldiers and planners believed the democracies were too soft to endure this kind of discipline. They imagined populations spoiled by choice, citizens who would fracture when asked to sacrifice comfort for endurance. Yet the reality they encountered, first through intelligence reports, then through captured propaganda, then through the unbelievable scenes of Allied supply, was something different. Societies that could be both consumer nations and ration nations, both abundant and restrained, because their restraint was chosen, argued over, administered, and crucially, shared. The contrast was sharpest in how each system explained hunger. In Britain, rationing began early, January 1940, because survival demanded it. The Ministry of Food took control, issuing ration books to every person. People registered with specific retailers. Coupons became a controlled bloodstream of calories and fairness. Shortages made queues common. It was possible to wait for hours and reach the counter only to learn the item had just run out. Yet the structure, book, coupon, registration, told citizens that hardship was not a private failure, but a national condition managed in public. In the United States, the story began differently. America was not under blockade. It was becoming the arsenal of democracy. And yet, rationing arrived, because a global war can turn even abundance into scarcity at the point of distribution. Shipping space, tin for cans, rubber for tires, fuel for transport, labor for farms, steel for industry. A national voice explained the logic with plain urgency. Food for the Army and Navy, food for invasion fronts, food for allies, and less shipping space for civilian goods. Then came the question that defined democratic rationing: how to preserve freedom of choice while limiting consumption. The solution was point rationing, an attempt to ration without abolishing preference, to conserve without erasing individuality. If you want a single recurring symbol of how American democracy tried to make sacrifice visible, it can be this: the ration book. Not a weapon, not a flag, just paper. But paper backed by law, by volunteer boards, by posters in windows, by a national agreement that the home front would become a front of its own.
The ration book was small enough to fit in a purse, yet large enough to touch geopolitics. It carried the weight of convoys, the hunger of allies, and the steel needs of factories, translated into stamps with numbers 8, 5, 2, 1, small integers that stood in for ships and lives. In America, rationing began with what mattered most to morale: tires, then gasoline, then sugar. Tires were the first rationed product, January 1942, only weeks after Pearl Harbor, because rubber was war. Civilians could not simply buy new tires. They patched what they had, recapped treads, guarded serial numbers against theft, and applied to local boards if they had a justified need. The rationing system even generated a national speed ethic, a victory speed of 35 miles per hour to preserve tire life, because tires wore out twice as fast at 60 as at 35. The war reached into the pressure of air in rubber and made it a strategic resource. Gasoline rationing started on the East Coast in mid-May 1942 after German submarines targeted tankers. Then it expanded nationwide in December 1942. Windshields carried lettered stickers A, B, C, marking need and privilege in plain view. For most drivers, an A sticker meant only a few gallons a week. Others, critical workers, received broader access. There was even an X category, with no limit, reserved for VIPs, including members of Congress, controversial precisely because rationing was supposed to be a public creed rather than a private advantage. It was an imperfect equality, but it was equality argued about openly, and that mattered in wartime. Food rationing followed. The government began rationing sugar in May 1942. Coffee was added in November, then meats, fats, canned fish, cheese, and canned milk in March 1943. The system was not just restriction, but education. Posters, newspapers, home economics classes, advice columns, an entire national culture of substitution and conservation. Victory gardens were encouraged as both food strategy and civic ritual. Grow what you can what you grow, and send the factory-processed food to soldiers. Even in abundance, rationing created a psychological landscape familiar to Europeans: anticipation, rumor, panic buying. When an item was announced for rationing, consumers rushed stores, turning policy into sudden scarcity. Black markets followed like shadows. Illicit trade plagued everything from tires to meat. Authorities responded with hearings, prosecutions, and relentless messaging about fairness and restraint. The system was porous because human nature is porous, but the existence of rules and the fact that ordinary citizens staffed the boards enforcing them made rationing feel less like submission and more like participation.
In Britain, ration carried on longer and deeper, shaped by blockade fears and import dependence. The Ministry of Food oversaw coupons for basics like sugar, meat, fats, bacon, and cheese. Other goods, tinned items, dried fruit, cereals, biscuits, were handled through points whose values shifted with availability. Bread was never rationed during wartime, but shortages after victory were so persistent that bread was rationed in July 1946, an irony that haunted the British memory. Rationing endured into the early 1950s. Meat was the last to come off ration, and food rationing ended completely only in 1954. Germany and Japan provide the darker mirror in this story, because rationing there was bound to ideology that promised conquest as a solution to hunger. Japan had imported a significant share of its food before the war, and rationing began years earlier.
As the war tightened, civilian calories fell, and the black market became not a moral failing, but, for many, the path to survival. Neighborhood associations distributed rationed goods, and the fear of denunciation strained social life. Scarcity reinforced surveillance. Economic historians have noted that rationing in Britain, Germany, and Japan could be effective in the narrow sense, preventing mass starvation at home, even while choice and quality deteriorated. Yet the numbers show the slope. Caloric intake declined steadily, deficiencies rose, and health suffered. Even where mass famine was avoided, the body recorded the war in slowed growth and weakened resilience. Beyond the major powers, rationing often failed entirely. Starvation became a weapon, a consequence, or both. Requisitioning in occupied territories produced millions of deaths. Prisoners of war were deliberately underfed. Rationing, at its best, is a humane system, but it only works when a state still believes its citizens should live. Where that belief collapses, the coupon becomes meaningless paper, and hunger becomes policy. So what did Axis soldiers expect to find when they looked toward the democracies? They expected softness, citizens who would refuse limits, economies that would buckle under constraint, societies too individualized to submit to a shared standard. What many actually encountered was something else entirely. Democracies rationed not because they lacked productive power, but because they could redirect it. They restricted civilian buying not because shelves were empty forever, but because ships, tin, rubber, and fuel were being reassigned to global operations. The discipline was born not only of desperation, but of capacity. This is where the ration book becomes more than paper. It becomes a symbol of national faith, that a society can ask individuals to yield something, and do so without turning the request into permanent coercion. Posters taught that fairness was not automatic. It had to be designed, enforced, and explained. Rationing boards, staffed by volunteers, made the state visible not as a distant decree, but as neighbors behind a table. The system was frustrating, uneven sometimes, hypocritical, sometimes exploited, yet it created a daily rehearsal of shared obligation. In a world where dictatorships claimed unity through fear, democracies practiced unity through paperwork. Even the timeline of ending tells a story. In the United States, rationing faded as the war ended. In Britain, it persisted long after the guns fell silent. Victory did not immediately restore ordinary life, but in both places, the ration book prevented the kind of internal collapse enemies had predicted. A wartime historian could measure rationing in ounces and points, but people measured it in feelings, the weight of a queue, the embarrassment of asking for extra coupons, the pride of making a meal stretch, the anger toward black marketeers, the suspicion that someone else was cheating. These emotions mattered because morale is a resource as real as rubber. And the ration book carried both sides of that truth. On one page, restriction. On another, the promise that restriction was shared. Rationing did not only change diets, it changed perception. War was no longer something done only by soldiers. It was done by commuters driving slower, by parents patching shoes, by families turning lawns into gardens, by shopkeepers enforcing prices and collecting points. The home front was not only managed, it was moralized. Epilogue. When the war ended, some ration books were kept like relics. Others were discarded in relief. But the meaning remained. Because rationing was never just about having less, it was about choosing what to do with plenty. In dictatorships, scarcity hardened into hierarchy. In democracies, rationing, imperfectly, attempted fairness. And perhaps that is the quiet truth rationing leaves behind. Freedom is not proven only by what a society can buy. It is proven by what it can willingly limit and still remain itself.